Hello and welcome to Absolutely Not. My name is Katrina Stroll. My pronouns are they, she, he. You can learn more about me on my website, www.katrinastroll.com. Real quick, if you appreciate the work that I do here or elsewhere, please visit the Support the Mission page of my website. There are several options to choose from to support my work, so please choose one. The keywords for this episode are human rights, advocacy, and ethical. I encourage y'all to look up the definitions of these words and compare them to the definitions you carry with you on a daily basis. If you need help comparing, please let me know. This episode is sponsored by Headspace. Headspace has one mission to improve the health and happiness of the world through meditation, sleep, stress, and mindfulness. Find out more about Headspace at the link in the show notes. Today's episode is titled Don't Clip My Wings. And I'm excited to talk about this with our amazing special guest today, Misha Munim, she, her. Misha is a human rights lawyer and equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant based out of Toronto, Canada. She has worked on notable human rights projects across both Canada and South Africa, such as helping draft Canada's federal disability legislation, creating legal protections for racial and ethnic minorities against hate crimes, and advocating for gender justice in Cape Town's prisons. Ooh, she has worked with numerous organizations, helping them develop inclusive policies and practices and foster safe spaces where all people are treated with dignity. She identifies as a South Asian Muslim woman. Misha, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to get into it today. The title alone, Don't Clip My Wings. Misha, are people clipping your wings consistently?
Well, I mean, they tried, I think that sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we end up in spaces that don't want us to harness our full potential, that don't want us to tap into the unique gifts and the talents that we've been given. Because I think that sometimes they have an interest to kind of utilize our abilities and our skill sets, and sometimes, our quote unquote diversity to advance their objectives and their goals. And sometimes those goals and those objectives may not align with us. And so, kind of, what do we do then? We feel very constrained, we feel very restricted. And I think to kind of just unpack that briefly is, what if the organization that you find yourself in, their values are things like money or selfishness or power or oppression, and your values are not congruent with that? So for me, I ended up in a situation where I was trying to uphold my personal values of equity and inclusion and justice and honesty and integrity, and I just felt like nobody's listening to what I have to say and allowing me to express my values freely. And so I did feel like my wings were being clipped, figuratively speaking, because I wasn't given that freedom to kind of take flight, or to be in tune with myself, to understand myself, to exist as I am and as I was created to be.
Oh damn. I really love that so much. I love the take flight. If you don't feel like you're flying in an organization, if you don't feel like they will allow you to practice flying, or at the very least, like support you in practicing flying, then maybe that's not the best organization for you. I also love that you touched on different types of values. So often we're taught like, hey, values like honor or justice or equity and inclusion, but we don't talk about the other side of the spectrum. There are negative things that people hold value in: money, selfishness, power. When did you learn about that? The other side of the spectrum of values.
Yeah. So I think that I had to come face to face with those values to really understand that I am not like this, that I do not embody those values, but I had to kind of enter this organization that was interested in upholding those values. And on paper, they said all of the right things in terms of advancing equity and justice, but on the inside, kind of subliminally and implicitly this messaging was being given to myself and other people of kind of historically excluded backgrounds that, well, your voice isn't really quite welcome here, and this is not really the objectives that we're trying to advance. And so it was quite an oppressive environment. It was very stifling and kind of suffocating for people like myself and people of other marginalized and intersectional identities. And I think that it was coming really up close and personal with this opposition to my own values that I realized what my own values actually really are. And so, if it wasn't for that experience, I wouldn't have even realized what matters to me, what are the kind of rules that I want to live by, what my personal worldviews are. So, yeah.
I love that so much. And I get the image of like two bottles, one filled with oil and one filled with water, and you're trying constantly, like they're tied together, and you're like, let's mix them. Come on, let's try to mix. And they just will not mix. There's a reason for that. And not knowing the reason, I mean, that's half the battle, but the first step is being like, these will not mix. There is nothing I can do to mix these two things because they just won't. I love this that we're touching on this because sometimes I feel guilty about like how much I could not have been proactive, but there's so much you can't be proactive about it because what if they're straight up lying or they look good on paper? Do you ever have some emotions around like how much you weren't able to be proactive?
It was hard, Katrina. There were not a lot of options on the table because I think first, when you have that awakening initially that I'm not like them and I do not embody the values that you are trying to advance, which I don't think anybody should hold those values of like being centered around kind of just money and power and oppression. Um, but I think once you have that recognition, you do have to start kind of making moves to create safety for yourself because it actually starts harming you. It not just harms you psychologically, it starts harming us physiologically as well, right? There are very negative health impacts of experiences of racism and discrimination. And I think once you start internalizing that harm, you realize like my body is not okay and I cannot continue to internalize this negative conduct any longer. And so you have to kind of enable yourself to do something about it, but it's very, very, very difficult. And so that can look like different things, right? So I think if you have the ability to move within the organization to create kind of a safer space for yourself where perhaps you report to somebody else or you're in a different section altogether where that same level of injustice is not happening to you and around you, then I think you can carve out a pocket of safety for yourself. But for me, for example, I did not feel like that was really a possibility. And I did have to end up walking away from the organization because I just didn't feel like I had a choice. And I didn't see any other kind of realms of safety in the nearby vicinity. And so it was important for me to make that decision for myself so that my own values and my own safety and my own well being was not being compromised any longer.
And I'm so grateful that you were able to come to that conclusion. The words that you keep using is like my values,
Mm.
my this, my that. And I want people to understand it's because this is your life. Like who else? What if you centered other people's values in your own life? And they weren't you know what I mean? Like that takes so long to get to that mindset, and I am so grateful that you were able to get there before more harm was caused to you. Was there anybody in that organization that you went to with these concerns or with this unsafe behavior that was supportive in these new moves that you were doing?
Oh, absolutely. I went to the person in the highest position of power, and I was ringing the alarm for a very long time, Katrina. Like, I was speaking up, like, from within the walls of the organization, I was talking and I was reporting the misconduct, the wrongful behavior, the constant kind of racism and xenophobia and inflammatory remarks about people of marginalized identities that I kept hearing. And they were not always directed towards me, but they were harming people who, like I said, yeah, identify in different ways. And I just didn't think that it was okay. And somebody who's in a position of power, who has the discretion and the authority to address it, I was like, oh, let me knock on their door and kind of tell them what's up. And so then I waited and waited for an adequate response. And let me tell you that there was no response. That the people who were in the positions of power were very well aware of this conduct because it was happening well before I even arrived, right? And they were well aware of it, and they were just unwilling to change or to address the perpetuators of the harm. And so, yeah, I mean, if the people who are in control are not willing to address the harm and rectify it and create safety for people, you don't really have much of a choice there.
And again, the word proactive keeps coming to me because will try. Like we as human beings, we want to be safe. We're trying, we ask the right questions in interviews, da da da. But just like you said, this behavior has been happening for a while. So there's very little you can do. They value this behavior more
Mm-hmm.
than the new person that's coming in with safer behavior.
Mm-hmm.
How are you able to like not internalize any of that messaging? Like we value this unsafe behavior more than you.
Yeah, it's like outwardly, sometimes for your own safety, you have to go along with what people expect you to do and behave like. But inwardly, if that's your only option, then you inwardly reject with all of your heart and your spirit what the other person is doing and how they expect you to be. And so I did that a lot. And one of the most inspiring books I've read is Untamed by Glennon Doyle. And in that, she talks about this thing called the knowing with a capital K. And she says that this knowing exists inside of all of us. And it's basically our truth and it guides us. And all we have to do is go inside and like tap into that truth. And I found myself doing that constantly. So first, I was kind of encountered with um, this behavior of, as you said, Katrina, like getting me to jump on this ship along with them to start embracing those values. Because in order to get a promotion, in order to move up, in order to enter any kind of like position of power, you do have to start embodying their values and kind of appease the oppressor, so to speak, right? And so that rejection of knowing that that's not who I am and that's not what I want to be. I don't want to be like you. And I think I was very lucky because prior to entering that space, I had a lot of mentors who nurtured me and took really good care of me. And on the title of this event, they did not clip my wings. They let me fly. They let me be free. They let me harness my potential. They looked at my strengths and they kind of helped me advance in my career. But when I found that that wasn't happening in this space and that I'm not like you and that I'm probably never going to be able to move up in this organization because we're so different. I think just that constant rejection internally, right? Like I am not like this. Okay, well I'm not like this, but who am I? Right? So that kind of deep dive inside. And there's this quote by Rumi that he says, when will you take that long journey into yourself?
Oh, I love this because even if you're saying I'm not like these people, I cannot be better. So then what are you? If you're not racist, are you anti-racist? Are you okay with racism? Because even before when you were talking about how some of the harm wasn't directed towards you or people that share your identities, they were directed towards people who share other identities that may not be similar to you. Even in that, you have to be like, is this okay? It's not directed towards me. Like, w- where in that did you kind of like shake out or shift out, like, no, none of this can be. I cannot be any of this.
I love the way that you said none of this can be because literally every human being has the right to be treated with dignity and with respect no matter how they identify. And no other person can tell them you are not worthy of dignity, you are not worthy of respect because inherently you are. You are created as a human being. And I think that you deserve that right. And so, whether you identify as a person of intersectional various identities, if you have a disability, or you identify as LGBTQ plus, or for me, I like we talked about at the beginning, I identify as a racial and ethnic minority. Um, there's so many different characteristics of people's identities that make them who they are, that make them beautiful. And I think that if anybody kind of infringes on their right to exist authentically or to just be treated with respect, I just think that's never okay.
And oh, okay. To anybody who may have been sitting on the fence or like in the wishy-washy part of the shallow end of the pool of equity and inclusion and ethical, just dignity for all human beings, I hope that you dive in. I hope that this word that you heard today just allows you to make that decision like, no, none of this can be. It's not just for me, it's just not just for my identities, but everyone, just like you said, should be allowed respect and dignity. Damn, how you are deep into the waters of respect and dignity. How long have you been swimming, or how long have you been flying, or how long have you been this deep?
I mean, I think I really had to come in tune with my identity as a human rights lawyer and what that means. And I didn't choose that for myself. It was just kind of, whether you want to call it the universe or the cosmos that kind of brought me into alignment with those recognitions. And so I started my journey working in Canada, working on a lot of human rights issues. And then I journeyed to South Africa, which was a really remarkable, life changing experience because there is still that struggle to eradicate the remnants of apartheid. And so human rights work is very much alive and present there. And that was really transformative for me to see how important advancing justice really is. Um, and so I think that when I started harnessing that identity as being my own, that I am here to advance justice for people in my role as a human rights lawyer, there was no real walking away from that. And so, I've been doing this work for several years. Um, but did I always know myself and know my values? No.
Hmm. And I this make me think of another actually diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner. Her name is Maida Sura, and she's on LinkedIn if y'all know who this person is.
I
But
know her.
yeah, okay. Okay. But she pointed out to me that occupational identity is just as heavy as any other identity that you may hold. Like these responsibilities and values that come with the occupation you're doing for 40 plus hours a week, it has to weigh on you at some point. It has to become who you are, and you have to take ownership in it of like, what type of human rights lawyer do I want to be? What type of psychological safety consultant do I want to be? Have you met other human rights lawyers or people in your field who are not the same as you, although you hold the same occupational identity?
Absolutely. I mean, I was kind of surrounded by that, right? Kind of being in this organization whose mandate literally says in writing that we uphold justice and equity and advance the rights of people from marginalized identities. And then in reality, that's just not what's happening in practice, you know? So I think that it's important to be able to see people's truths for who they are and not just what's kind of being shown publicly or through kind of like PR. A lot of organizations, as you know, have very kind of robust public relations mechanisms where they might be purporting to be something, but do they truly embody those values, right? Authentically. And so, I mean, I have met wonderful people along my journey who do share my values and my worldviews. It's just unfortunate that we often find ourselves kind of on the peripheries and the margins because it's not in the interests of kind of people in positions of power to advance the objectives and the values that we're here to advance, right? Going back to South Africa, I mean, when people were fighting against apartheid, uh, their voices were not the ones that were being kind of amplified and turned all the way up. They were being ostracized and harmed constantly. And so I think when we find people who are kind of willing to be brave and to speak their truth and to exist as they are, which is a journey in and of itself, I think when we cross paths, our spirits recognize each other. And I'm like, hey, I love who you are and I'd like to be closer to you.
Shout out the knowing, shout out the knowing. Like that knowing, it seems like they know a lot of stuff. And to anybody who's listening to this who may not be in tuned in the knowing yet, like please listen to me. Like it knows a lot of stuff. So please start talking to it. I love that you talked about, you kind of touched on xenophobia earlier, and that made me think of the same types of messagings that people who are going into places get, like, why don't you go back to where you came from? Or like, oh, if you don't like the people in the field, why don't you leave the field? Misha, why have you not left the field?
Oh, I think this work is so important, Katrina. And so I kind of switched roles. Like I am an equity, diversity, inclusion consultant now, so I'm not actively practicing as a lawyer. I only practice law pro bono. But in my consulting role, I think that I have a responsibility to help people who were in similar positions that I was in, where they feel like they have no voice. And a lot of times, organizations just lack the structure to create safety for people. So, what do your policies look like? What do your procedures look like? Where can somebody go when they experience this level of harm that is affecting them psychologically and physically? And if you don't have those structures, let's build them. And if they're not robust enough, then let's create strength around them. And it can't just be a process where you go report something to HR, because historically, a lot of systems, and I think, we all have to awaken to this reality that they're embedded in colonial and Eurocentric ways of being, and they're not created by us and for us. And so I think really structurally going into an organization to help them establish the kind of the not just the blueprint, but then manifest it into something that can create safety for people, right? I think that that piece is extremely important. And then just listening, right? So many leaders don't listen to the voices of people who've been historically excluded. And so, how are you going to advance on your journey to achieve equity, diversity, and inclusion if you're not listening and you're not paying attention to the people who are being harmed?
I love this so much. And it makes me think about a similar messaging that I share in my own consulting is like specificity, like specifically, where can I go to speak to someone about racism? Specifically, where can I go to speak to someone about xenophobia? Where can I go? And it also makes me think of another DEI practitioner, Cindy Yap, she, her, who is also on LinkedIn, but she constantly talks about the immigration process into anywhere and how most employers don't have support for that. Like they just don't have any specific type of place that you can go to, and HR is very like umbrella world or whatever. But the specificity that is needed to people who are being historically marginalized, oppressed to the point where they can't even make it to wherever y'all trying to make us be, is what is needed. Thank you so much to bringing that to this space, because there are a lot of organizations out there who are still on like level one of like, all right, let's dip our toes in diversity and equity and inclusion. What would you encourage them to do around, besides the policies? You need more, you definitely need more around being more specific and what their employees need.
I think that there has to be an attentive um, focus on people from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds and other intersectional and marginalized identities. It's not just racial and ethnic minorities that, whose cause I try to advance in my work and our work collectively, Katrina. Really, like, I think that it's important to understand the lived experiences of people who don't identify in the same way as you. And how are you going to do that if you don't listen, if you don't tap in to those connections, if you don't kind of um, understand that this person has different experiences, different thoughts, different worldviews than you do, and it's your responsibility to cultivate an environment where they're able to be their authentic selves as well, right? And to your point about the immigration, I mean, so living in Canada, I live in one of the most diverse cities in the world, Toronto, and we have a huge influx of new immigrants coming in from all different parts of the world. And so diversity in and of itself, that effort will be futile if you haven't created the mechanisms of safety to invite people from different backgrounds to come in and express themselves freely. And they are going to think differently. They've been conditioned differently. I only came to Canada when I had already lived half of my life. And so, we have to start tapping into people's differences.
With the values that you talked about in place. Because if what if there are so many organizations who don't even have like a mission statement or a values or anything written down. And if you don't have it written down, how am I supposed to, build trust with you? Like, what are we valuing here? Like, where are we going with this? When was the last time you had to tell maybe a client that you're working with, like, okay, where are we going with this? Like, where are we trying to get to?
Yeah, all the time, right? I mean, so gender identity is a prohibited ground of discrimination that was recently introduced into Canadian human rights legislation. And so a lot of organizations still haven't kind of caught up with using appropriate gender pronouns, and they'll use language like his or her in their policies. And so I'm just like immediately erase there and replace it quickly, right? And it's just that easy. And like they didn't know about that. They didn't know A, about their legal obligation, and they didn't know B, that this is a best practice to foster true inclusion for people, um, gender inclusion for people. But that's just a starting point, right? You've put something on paper, but now how are you going to implement that? And so then there's that whole coaching piece of like, well, how do we foster inclusion in real time for people? How do we actively not harm people, right? And one of the key principles underpinning that is that your intention does not matter. It's about the impact that you create for people. And so that's something that is a constant work in progress, but I think we're gaining some momentum in people having increased buy-in. But it is an uphill road, Katrina.
And I love that intention impact point because for some reason, no, for a lot of reasons, people have such a hard time wrapping their heads around like it does not matter if you think that you're the savior of this organization or you think you're going to wrap this up with a pretty bow. How have you impacted your employees in these past 6 months that we've been working together or this past year that we've been working together? If it's like 2%, then maybe one, you wasted my time and your time and money and resources and a whole bunch of stuff. But that's what's most valuable is the impact that you've made on your employees. Thank you so much for reminding these people because they be forgetting on a on a constant basis. They forget. To the people who are maybe sitting and listening to this and thinking, you know what? I've done a lot of stuff with good intention and I've really haven't checked on the impact. How could they kind of check on the impact of what they've been doing?
Yeah, I think it's really important to pay attention to how people are feeling around you based on what you say and based on what your conduct is. And I think everyone should be striving to kind of uphold behavior and conduct that is just inherently very respectful of people around you. And so just be cognizant of the fact that you might say something completely unintentionally that has harmed somebody. And so take responsibility, take accountability over it, take ownership over that, rectify the harm if you've caused any, right?
I love it. I love it. I love it. To the people who are currently employed by organizations who may be thinking, you know what? I'm going to go into my place of work tomorrow and have a conversation about how I would like to feel respected, how I feel valued at this organization, or matter of fact, what I hold as values in this organization. What would be the top 3 tips you would share with them about having this conversation?
I would say first get to know yourself, turn off all the noise, just get clarity on who you are, what your values are, what is your purpose, or what are the purposes that you were created for. Each one of us is unique. You know, this is such a basic example, but we're so unique that no one in this world even shares our thumbprints, right? And so we all have these kind of unique abilities, and we don't have the time or the opportunity to really come in tune with that. So getting clarity on ourselves, I think, is number one. I think secondly, I would say don't let anybody dictate to you what you can and cannot do. Don't let anybody minimize you. You don't have any limitations in terms of who you can be and how you can express yourself. And so if anybody tries to discourage you from upholding good values, don't pay attention to that. And then finally, I would just say know your worth. So once you know your worth, I think you immediately know when somebody is trying to restrict you or limit your potential or clip your wings, figuratively. You are a valuable human being. You have gifts, you have talents, you have creative juices flowing through, you have something to give the world, and you have to share your gifts. And, we can't just be sitting around squandering our beautiful energies, being exploited and oppressed by other people. We have to get out there, we have to fly and be free and see how high we can go and what we can achieve.
Damn, I am enjoying these tips that you have shared. The people in the audience are enjoying the tips that you have shared. Somebody tomorrow is going to start flapping. They will go into the office and just flap all over the desk, knock down everything. And I am so happy for that person because they were able to hear that amazing tips from you. One of the things I mean, I'm definitely going to cite you for it, but I'm adding it to like my next keynote as soon as we get off this call. I'm about to add it to everything. Is the thumbprint thing? Oh my gosh, y'all, we nobody on this planet has the same thumbprint. Write it down. You are unique in your very own way. Oh, yeah, I'm about to cite you on everything. But thank you so much for sharing that here. Are there any last minute sprinkles you'd like to share with the audience?
I would just say be brave. Don't be afraid. Fear held me back for so long, for so many years, and there were people around me who just encouraged me to be brave, to tap into myself, to tap into that truth, and to not let fear guide you. Let your truth guide you. And I think that has been the most liberating thing.
Ooh, the knowing, the truth, the worth, the knowing, the truth, the worth. Yes. Repeat it several times if you need to. Thank you so much, Misha, for being on this show and being an amazing special guest. For everyone who's listening, her information will be in the show notes when this is published. Keep setting those boundaries and saying absolutely not to everything unaligned. We will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Katrina.